When I first became interested in the topic of the Federal Reserve System, I was aware that the Fed was formed not in Washington, D.C., not in the halls of Congress or some meeting room, but it was formed on a private island off the coast of Georgia called Jekyll Island. That's the reason I called my book The Creature from Jekyll Island, because here it was a strange thing that something as important as the Federal Reserve System was created on a private island off the coast of Georgia. That aroused my curiosity. I didn't think too much about it until I got into the details of the history, and what I found was absolutely amazing. First of all, this island in those days was privately owned. It was a resort island. It was a club. They called the Jekyll Island Club. And its members were a relatively small group of billionaires from New York, people like J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller and their business associates and their families. And they went there during the cold winter months because they wanted to get away from the ice and snow from New York. And so Jekyll Island in those days was a private resort, and they had a beautiful clubhouse there. In fact, it's still standing for anybody who wants to go there and visit it. The island has been preserved in many of these cottages, which they called them in those days, which were the summer resort homes of the very wealthy, are still there, and you can visit them, and it's quite an example of the elegance and opulence of the turn of the century. But the key feature is the clubhouse. And the clubhouse is where this meeting took place. And I thought, isn't that strange? And I got into it and I discovered that not only did they go to this island for the meeting, but they went under conditions of great secrecy. I can assure you that very few wars of history have ever been plotted under conditions of greater secrecy than that. For example, when they went to the island, they all traveled aboard the private railroad car of Senator Nelson Aldrich. He sent his railroad car to the New Jersey Railroad Station. This was November of 1910. And he and 6 other men, who I'll describe in a moment, arrived under conditions that they were told they mustn't be seen together. They couldn't come together. They couldn't dine together on that evening. And they must avoid newspaper reporters at all costs, because in those days, newspaper reporters used to hang out at the New Jersey Railroad Station because it was a way to catch photographs or interviews of famous people coming in and out of New York. And they were told to avoid newspaper reporters. One of them carried a shotgun in a big black case. Just in case he had been confronted by a reporter, he was prepared to tell them that he was going on a duck hunting trip. And the funny thing about that is that we learned later from his children and his biographers that this man never owned a gun. He had borrowed that shotgun just as a decoy and as part of the deception. When they got on board this railroad car, they were told, even in the privacy of this car, not to address each other by last names, first names only. And 2 of them even went further and refused to address each other by first names. They adopted code names. I thought, well, that seems strange, even in the privacy of Senator Aldrich's car. Well, it turned out that one of the men wrote about it in later years, and he said the reason for that is that they were concerned that the identities of all of these 7 men might be known to the servants on board the car, and that the servants might talk about it. In that fashion, the word would get out, and then, of course, the purpose of the meeting would have been defeated in their opinions. And so this is the kind of secrecy that surrounded that. Even when they got to the island, and then they got off the train and took the ferry across the inland straits there and went to the clubhouse, they had replaced all of the normal servants with new servants who didn't know any of these people. This is the kind of precautions that went on. And they created the Federal Reserve under those kinds of conditions of secrecy. And then when they came back to New York, and disappeared back into the environs of Wall Street, for quite a while thereafter, these men denied that such a meeting ever took place. They said, oh, no, that's just pure rumor. That's nonsense. Later, it began to leak out, and they said, yes, we went to the meeting, but we just went to do some hunting and play some poker and drink some good whiskey, that kind of thing, you know. Finally, after the Federal Reserve System was firmly established and became accepted and almost revered in the eyes of Americans as a great American institution, then they finally began to talk about this meeting, who was there, how they went, and why the secrecy. And most of this is now written in their memoirs, or in their biographies, or in interviews they gave with newspaper reporters and that sort of thing, so that if you go to any well-stocked library today, you can learn in minute detail exactly what happened on Jekyll Island, why they went, who these people were, and especially you will learn why the secrecy. Now, what is the reason for the secrecy? In those days, there was a great deal of concern among the American people about the concentration of financial power in the hands of a few very wealthy and powerful financial interests in Wall Street. They called this the money trust in those days. If you look into the editorials of the time, you'll often find editorials condemning the money trust. And the cry in those days was to break the grip of the money trust. And one of the primary purposes of the Federal Reserve Act, as it was promoted to the American people, was just that, to break the grip of the money trust. They were going to write a law that was going to take the power away from these people and put it in the hands of their trustworthy politicians, you see. Put it in the hands of the people through the electoral process. That was the propaganda behind the Federal Reserve System. So what's the purpose of the secrecy? It's because when you look at the list of these people who went, they were the money trust. They were the representatives of the banks, of J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers. They represented Kuhn, Loeb and Company. They had connections, business relations with the Warburgs in Germany and the Netherlands and the Rothschilds in England. This was the money trust, not only of the United States, but of the world. These are the people who created the Federal Reserve System, supposedly to break the grip of their own power. You see. So now, had that fact been known, who these people were that were drafting the Federal Reserve System, the trick would have been exposed, and the public never would have adopted the Federal Reserve Act as, in fact, they did.